Parshas Bo, I've decided tonight to divide up our presentation into sections, into themes. The first theme, I want to start with the concept of kachatzos halayla. If you can open up your Chumash to Parshas Bo, Perek Yud Aleph, Pasuk Dalet. Vayomer Moshe Ko Amar Hashem Kachatzos Halayla Ani Yotzei Besoch Mitzrayim Umeis Kol B'chor B'Eretz Mitzrayim. Rashi already notices the Chaf Hadimyon Kechatzos, and Rashi gives a whole explanation because Hashem himself had declared not Kachatzos but Bachatzos, which means that God had declared that precisely at midnight, not a minute before, not even a second before, not a minute after, not a second after, he would go out to Mitzrayim and destroy the Bechoros. Not even an infinitesimal period of time would be off because it's Bachatzos. Moshe Rabbeinu had to say Kachatzos. Rashi explains why. But I believe that this is a very good introduction to tonight's discussion because there's a theme here of Bachatzos that's going to repeat itself a number of times in different forms throughout Parshas Bo. So we should learn it right up front. The Torah and the Jewish religion put a tremendous emphasis on infinitesimal sections of time, of seconds, and so forth. The Torah, in that sense, is very, very precise. And sometimes, in the world of Jewish law, a difference between 1 second and another second can make the entire difference. For example, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah in Gemara Pesachim and also in Gemara Brachos is of the opinion that the Korban Pesach has to be eaten at Chatzos and no later. If one were to eat the Korban Pesach, one infinitesimal part of a second beyond Chatzos, according to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, he has not discharged his obligation. He has forfeited the mitzvah of Korban Pesach. What this means is that the Torah requires discipline, and a good Jew is disciplined and doesn't take time lightly. He has a serious commitment to precision in time, and he who fails to do so may, if you pardon the figurative phrase, may miss the boat. And therefore, Judaism has, I think you'd say, a watch, and it walked around with a watch, a clock that tells precise time. And that means that we don't have the rights to tamper that with time. If we are laid back and we're not dedicated and disciplined, then we're not living up to the demands of Judaism. And I'll give you another example where we have to be very exact about time. And that is the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema. This is a mitzvah d'oraisa of great significance. And we have to be very precise about it. If we miss man Kriyat Shema by even an infinitesimal part of a second, we have forfeited a great mitzvah. So that it means that in every aspect of our lives, the Torah is very, very demanding and meticulous about being exact of time, and we have to be disciplined. What I'd like to indicate as we go along tonight is that this concept is absolutely central in understanding the Geula from Avdus L'Cherus. Let us turn for a moment to the beginning of Perek Yud Beis. And this, as Rashi already indicates at the beginning of his Perek al Torah back in Bereshis, is the first mitzvah in the Torah. Vayomer Hashem al Moshe v'al Aaron v'eretz Mitzrayim le'mar chodesh hazeh lachem Rosh Chodesh. We are commanded to sanctify the new moon. And this mitzvah primarily falls on the shoulders of the Beis Din HaGadol, the highest court of Israel. And back in the day, they were Makadesh al pi Re'iyah. Re'iyah means that two witnesses would come and testify that they saw the new moon. And that's how we would determine whether the previous month was a chaser or mole. To make a long story short, we no longer have Beis Din HaGadol, but yet we still have the mitzvah of HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem. And my question to you is, how do we fulfill this mitzvah in our time, in the absence of Beis Din HaGadol? And the answer, I believe, is the mitzvah of Kiddush Levana. First of all, even before we get to Kiddush Levana, on the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh, despite the fact that we have a calendar that pre-calculates exactly when Rosh Chodesh is, we still have to engage in what we call HaRav, and we have to announce when the new moon will be seen. And this takes place in the synagogue following Kriyas HaTorah in front of the tzibur. Every single tzibur is a microcosm of Klal Yisrael. And it means that through Kiddush Levana and Kiddush HaChodesh, these two entities, one earlier than the other, we now replace the Beis Din and we sanctify the new month. And I would say even further, it's not that we're replacing the Beis Din, is that when there was Kiddush al pi Re'iyah, Beis Din represents Klal Yisrael. What do I mean? What power and what authority is vested in the Beis Din to declare Rosh Chodesh? After all, the Torah says, HaChodesh hazeh lachem. Lachem means that the authority is invested in Klal Yisrael. In fact, that's why we recite at the conclusion of every bracha on the Yomim Tovim, Baruch Atah Hashem, Mekadesh Yisrael Mazmanim. And Chazal explained, Mekadesh Yisrael Shemekadshim Mazmanim. The entire episode of Kiddush Hazman is in our hands, in the hands of Klal Yisrael. But what does that mean? How do we gather together? How do we engineer and orchestrate that the entire Klal Yisrael could be Mekadesh L'Chodesh? The answer is that we have our elected representatives, and they are the Beis Din HaGadol. They are doing our bidding. They are our proxy, and they are sanctifying the new moon on our behalf. But what happens if there is no Beis Din HaGadol? Then the power and the authority reverts back to its original source, and that's Klal Yisrael. So when and how do we get together as a Klal and we are Makadesh, we sanctify the new month? The answer is when we get together for Kiddush HaChodesh and we say Chaverim Kol Yisrael and we pick up Sefer Torah. Whenever you have a Sefer Torah, it's considered as a flagstaff to which the entire tzibur gravitates. And when we stand with the Sefer Torah and we declare when the new month is, we are in effect being Mekadesh L'Chodesh. So let not anyone claim that the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh is gone. And after the Beis Din HaGadol was no longer an authoritative entity, we lost the mitzvah. No, we still have the mitzvah. In fact, you could say that we have the mitzvah in its original form. And we now, as Klal Yisrael, will sanctify the new month. The Torah itself, the Sefer Torah, unifies all of Klal Yisrael into one entity. Of course, every tzibur is a microcosm of Klal Yisrael, but when Jews, the globe over, will be Mekadesh Levana, they are declaring, yes, we have declared and determined when is the new month. And it's fascinating on a philosophical level to think about the fact that this is the first mitzvah in the Torah, which certainly gives it significance. Rashi, at the beginning of the Chumash, goes as far as to say that the Torah could have skipped all of Sefer Bereishis and a chunk of Sefer Shmos and just begun with Parshas Bo HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodesh. That's how significant it is. And why is it so? HaKadosh Baruch Hu challenges us and obligates us to sanctify time. One of the most central fundamental principles in all of Jewish thought, and certainly in Jewish law, is the sanctity of time. Time is a precious entity, and we cherish it. It's almost like a living entity with a neshama of its own, so that now we can be Makadosh the Zman. And how do we sanctify the time? First and foremost, by being Makadosh the Chodesh. This is so unique to Klal Yisrael when the Greeks persecuted the Jews around the time of Baisheni, Hanukkah time. They were attacking the institution of Kiddush HaChodesh, of the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh. Why? Why is that mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh so significant? And I always claim that if you want to know which mitzvah keeps us together as a Jewish people, then look at our enemies. When they attack a particular mitzvah, that's because they know that that's keeping us all together. So what was so significant about Kiddush HaChodesh? And the answer is there's no other nation on the face of the earth that considers the time as something that we can hallow and something that we can sanctify. That is unique to the people of Israel. And once again, this brings home and emphasizes something that's so central to Judaism that we cannot overemphasize it. The sanctity of time, our relationship to time as an entity that generates obligations and requires discipline, is something that is so central to Judaism that makes us the Am Skula, the Am Kadosh, because we see time as something to be sanctified. This awareness of time divides into three different subcategories. The first is retrospection. The second is evaluation, and the third is anticipation. Retrospection means not only do we have a memory, not only to recall the past, and we read the Sefer Sfarim, and we learn about what happened to the Avos and the Mahos and the Shvatim, Yaakov and Esav, Avram and Nimrod, and so forth and so on. But it's much more than that. The collective memory of Klal Yisrael is not just retrospective, but it means we have a living experience with the past. We live in the past. We relive the past. And every single young child, boy or girl that gets sent to a boy to a cheder and a girl to a Beis Yaakov, whatever school she goes to, is trained from birth almost to relive the past. We don't just read stories about Avram and Sarah, about Avram and the Akedah with Yitzchak, and the confrontation between Esav and Yaakov. Already as children, we re-experience these past episodes. And that means that a child is nervous when Yaakov goes in to take the brachas because he's worried maybe Esav is going to catch him on, red-handed. And that is exactly what the Torah wants. When we read the Talmud, when we learn about greats like Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, all these greats, these are not just names from the past. These are not just history books that we read. We relate to their lives. They become part of us. So that's retrospection. And we'll see in our parsha a great example of this retrospection. But then a Jew is constantly aware of the future, anticipation. And he longs and pangs for the end of days, for the redemption, for Hoya Bayom Ahu, when Hashem Echad will be the one God, the sovereign ruler that will be accepted by all men on the face of the earth. So we have a vision for the future. But not the least important is the present. We value every single moment as a challenge. And will we live up to the obligation? We'll be precise about it. Bachatzos halayla, as we discussed before. And we are committed to a disciplined life in which we appreciate every single moment that passes as a great opportunity. The Kotzker Rebbe used to say, he had asked his Hasidim, how many mitzvahs are there? Oh, they would all yell out 613. Name, he said. That's wrong. There's only one mitzvah, the mitzvah that you're obligated in now. You can live in infinity if you take advantage and embrace the moment, the present. So on the one hand, the Jew is absolutely emotionally charged by the drama of Jewish history, by learning the Tanakh and the Talmud. But on the other hand, the Jew feels the rhythm of time, the march as it moves towards the end of days, anticipating the future. In that sense, we imitate God because Haya Hove V'yeh, God spans all of infinity, all time dimensions, past, present, and future. And so does the Jew. Therefore, when we cherish the present, what we mean is we have visions, expectations, and anticipations for the future, but we cherish every moment as it comes. And as I said before, if the Sofsman Kriya Shema is at 9 a.m. and he davens Kriya Shema at 9:05, he has missed the opportunity. He has missed the mitzvah. Hashem gives us this great gift of time. And here, my friends, it's not coincidental that this message and this central philosophy is here in Parshas Bo, dedicated to Yetzias Mitzrayim, because the slaves don't appreciate time. They don't have control over time. A free man is in charge and he's obligated to use his time. And this is the first expression of Yetzias Mitzrayim, of freedom. Can we live up to our obligation to utilize time and exploit it to its ultimate? And where do we see this concept of what we call retrospection coming to the perhaps its most dramatic pinnacle? It's right here in Parshas Bo. And if you fast forward for a moment to Perek Yud Beis, with regard to the mitzvah of eating the Korban Pesach, Pasuk Yud Aleph, the Torah demands b'chipazon, v'achaltem oso b'chipazon. Eat it in great haste. It's fascinating that the Rambam took this pasuk and formulated a paragraph at the very beginning of his Haggadah based on this pasuk. The Rambam opens up the mitzvah of Magid, the second kos of Yayin, with the words, Bebehilu yatzanu mitzrayim. We left Mitzrayim hurriedly. Now, what's the difference whether we left Mitzrayim 1 minute earlier, 1 minute later? And the Rambam considers this the flagstaff of Magid. He opens Magid with the Behilu Yatzu Avoseinu Mitzrayim. And the answer is, if we're about to begin a Seder, and freedom means time consciousness, then the concept of chipazon is so critical. Realize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is taking us out of Mitzrayim. He's redeeming us. We have a critical moment of redemption. Let's not miss the boat. If we get there too late, if we're not ready to leave, if we're waiting for our bread to bake, we may just miss the opportunity for freedom and for Yetzias Mitzrayim. But I think that this concept reaches its ultimate pinnacle in a pasuk, if we turn back to the beginning of Parshas Bo, a pasuk that we're all so familiar with. Perik Yud pasuk Beis, Leman Tisaper Bi Ozne Bincha. This is the mitzvah of Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim. Let me call your attention to the word Tisaper. Tisaper is a conjugated verb, the noun of which is sefer. And a person who's involved in writing a sefer is called a sofer. So we have three words that are all belonging to the same exact root, and that is tisaper or saper, sofer, and sefer. This, my friends, defines the essence of the Jewish people. And let me explain why. Chazal tell us that there's a difference between what's called an igeres and a sefer. Two concepts which are very similar, but Chazal teach us are fundamentally different. Megillas Esther originally was called an igeres. It was a letter. And then it was upgraded to the status of a sefer and included in the canon of the 24 Sifrei HaKodesh. The difference is that when a person writes a letter, he is not meticulous about every word. The choice of words come almost as an emotion would flow. And if he receives a letter from someone else, chances are that he'll throw it in the rubbish bin. Maybe he'll hold on to it for a couple of weeks or a month. But it's not something permanent. It's not something eternal. That's an igeres. But by contrast, we have something called a sefer. We are called the Amas Sefer. What does it mean that we are the nation of the sefer? What is a sefer? The Gemara tells us, and it's a Mishnah in Avos as well, but it's a Gemara here in Masechta Psachim, that at the end of the sixth day of creation, God created many, many things during that Bein HaShmoshos, twilight going into Shabbos, the first Shabbos of creation. And on the list is Ksav HaMichtav. Now, Ksav means a script. Everything that's on that list that was created Bein HaShmoshos, so the first Shabbos, is all in anticipation of great miracles that would happen, like the Man and Kriyas Yamsuf and many other miracles. What is Ksav? Where is the miracle in Ksav that God gave us the script, he gave us the letters of the alphabet, and now we can create a Ksav, another word from the same shoresh, a Ksav of a sefer? And the answer, my friends, again, comes back to our original thesis of our time consciousness. A sefer is something that gives us insight that goes way beyond the letters that are written. This is not just the expression and the pronouncement of a letter of somebody who authored and formulated words and sentences and paragraphs. This is something that's meticulous. Every single letter and even the tagim on top of the letters has a meaning, has a significance. Hafochba v'afochba dekulaba. There are layers and layers upon deeper meanings that are hidden under the Ksav. And that gives the Ksav an amazing power. It becomes the Jewish legacy, a bequeathment from one generation to the other. Why is it that of all nations of the world, I can think of only one in particular that doesn't suffer from what they call in the modern Western world a generation gap? You know, there's a gap between parents and children, between parents and grandchildren. You know, children don't pay attention to the words because it's a different generation. What do they know? But in Judaism, we have a secret weapon, and that's the Ksav. That's the Sefer. That's the miracle of Judaism. What's written on the Sefer is passed and transmitted through all generations. It is the link between one generation and the next. And it means that there's no generation gap because we're all tied and connected to the Sefer. When we read of the stories of the Sefer, we re-experience them, as we said about retrospection. Haya hove v'yeh. We live in the past. I remember when I was a child in the city of Chaslavich, and there were wintry days, and I was trudging through the snow under difficult circumstances. I imagine what was it like in the time of Avram Avinu when he and Sarah were trudging through the land of Canaan and all the difficulties that they faced. And when, as a young boy, I read the Sefer about the Akedah, I was re-experiencing both Avram and his tribulations and Yitzchak's. That's the greatness of a Sefer. It brings us back in a time machine, and yet it connects all generations together. The Haftorah of the Shabbos Hagadol ends with the words "V'heshiv le'avos al banim." The Amalekis try to break the connection between one generation and the other, but our secret weapon is that connection of generations, that transmission through the Sefer. And when we speak about the mitzvah of Leman Tisaper on the night of Pesach, what we're really talking about is Chayev Adam Liros Es Atzmo Kihilu Hu Yotzim Mitzrayim. We are not just reading an Igeres, a history book. Let the archaeologists get involved in that. We're not archaeologists. We're not living in the history books. But rather, Leman Tisaper means that we go back in a time machine 3,500 years, and we experience the exodus from Mitzrayim, and he who doesn't has not fulfilled his obligation. That's the greatness of the Sefer. That's what it means, retrospection. That's what it means, Leman Tisaper, to tell your son. What you tell your son is Tisaper, is based on a Sefer. He has to identify with the past and re-experience it. The reason why we consider the most important task of a father is to be a sofer. A sofer means to write svarim, meaning to transform all the books of the Torah into sefer that he can transmit as a legacy to his children and to his grandchildren. For all eternity, we are called the Am Sefer, the people of book. I would say not because we possess a book, but we are a book. And we identify with the Sefer. That's what the mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim is all about. I'd like to talk to you for a moment about another theme that I think is very important in this parsha. It really begins back in Parshas Shmos, continues in Parshas Va'era, but here it comes to its pinnacle, and that is the shlichus, the proxy, or the responsibility of Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu was very hesitant, as you recall, to accept upon himself the responsibility and the onus of being the leader of Klal Yisrael to redeem the people of Israel. He felt that he was not qualified. He was kvad peh, he was an onav mikol adam. He didn't think that he could possibly take upon himself such a massive task, such a shlichus, to be the shliach v'akadosh baruch hu, to redeem the people of Israel. But the key of keys lies in one word. The answer to Moshe Rabbeinu's arguments has two letters to it. Bo. Normally, when you send someone on a shlichus, you use the word lech. What does lech mean, and how is it different than bo? Lech means that the Mishaleach appoints a proxy, gives him power of attorney, and as an agent, he now operates on his own. He is completely independent of he who set him off. Lech, just go. You will serve to represent me, and legally your actions are binding because I've invested in you the power of attorney. This HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Moshe, you're right. If I were to appoint you as that kind of a shlichus, the paradigm of which is a legal power of attorney, then you have rights to claim. Who am I that you chose me for this incredibly important responsibility that you're placing on my shoulders? But HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, no, Moshe Rabbeinu, your shlichus is not that of lech, but rather of bo. Bo means bo, let's go together. Bo imadi, come with me, says HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I will not forsake you. I will not ignore you. I will not send you lech to a distance while I remain up in the seventh sphere. I will be with you. I will enter with you together into the chambers of Paro. And if I will be with you, you're guaranteed success. And therefore, the shlichus of Moshe Rabbeinu is so typical of a Navi. When a Navi is appointed as God's agent, he is not operating on his own, independent, far, far away from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. No, the Navi is accompanied by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's basically an entourage of two people that I wouldn't even call it shlichus, I would call it partnership, maybe a better word. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, let's work together towards the same goal. Imagine the case of two friends. They create a bond, a union, and they decide they're going to do this, they're going to do that. Each one has his role to play. And together, in unison, they accomplish that goal. It's a partnership. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Boi Modi, come with me. And together, in this very close, intimate, personalistic shlichus, we will both work for the same cause, and we will successfully redeem the people of Israel. Each one might act in a different way. Moshe Rabbeinu has his responsibility. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will do what he has to do. But this is the personalistic category of shlichus that belongs to the Nevi'im and now to Moshe Rabbeinu. When a shliach of this latter category goes out to operate and represent HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he feels the Almighty with him. He feels the Shekhinah entering with him. And therefore Hashem says to Moshe, Bo el Paro. Go to Paro with a sense of confidence. Bang your fist on the table and say, Shlaches Ami. Don't be an unav. Don't be your modest, cowardy, kind of sheepy personality. Be strong. Be confident. Use your power of speech. Take Aaron with you as your Navi. Bo el Paro. I will be there with you. And we have to know that every Shliach Tzibur throughout Jewish history, whether it be the Tanoim, the Amoraim, whether it be the great Rishonim, whether it be the leaders of Klal Yisrael throughout the generations, all of the above are Shliach Tzibur, Shluchei Tzibur, and a Shliach Tzibur has to know that Hashem is united together with the Shliach. They walk together arm in arm, and they are close. The Almighty is close to the Shliach. They speak out of one voice. They experience one experience, and they embrace infinity and achieve great things on behalf of Klal Yisrael. Such is the nature of the shlichus of Shluchei Tzibur throughout Jewish history. And when Esther HaMalka goes in, Kasher Avadati, she goes in with the Shekhinah. And when Mordechai gathers together the people and declares that we have to do tshuva and fast, he's with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he's the Shliach. And that's what we learn from Bo el Paro. I'd like to take a look at a very, very famous pasuk here at the beginning of Parshas Bo, in Perek Yud, pasuk Yud. Paro picks up his finger and he warns Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu says, we're going out, Bizkenenu, Binarenu, with our young, our youth, our older people. And Paro warns him, Ra'u ki ra'a neged pneicha. There is evil before your faces, in a literal translation. And Chazal say that Paro had conferred with the astrologists, and they told him that there's a kochav, which is called Ra'ah, it's a Simon Dam, and something terrible is going to happen to you. Moshe hears the warning, but yet he's unimpressed. Perhaps on a deeper level, Shivim Panim LaTorah, we can interpret Paro's warning in the following way. You want to go out with your people, men, women, and children, to create a select, unique community dedicated to serve, to celebrate with God. And Paro says, I see Ra'ah down the line. The nations of the world will not tolerate your separateness, your uniqueness, your community. They will rise up against you like a kochav ra, because you separate yourself from the non-Jews. You refuse to drink wine with them. You don't wear the same clothing they wear. You don't go to the same schools that they go to. You are separatists. That's going to incur the wrath and the hatred of many, many of the enemies of Israel. And so that really is a true description of Jewish history. We are different. We are unique. We don't enter into their houses of worship. We don't drink their wine, even if they just touch the wine. We have a separate society. And that society is willing to be moser nefesh, to sacrifice martyrdom for its own uniqueness. And therefore Moshe Rabbeinu says, if that's what it is, then so be it. We are good for the task. But who are we? Are we avodim to Paro? Take a look at the pasuk here, right here in front of our eyes, pasuk Zayin. Vayomru avdei Paro. I want you to take a linguistic analysis of these two words, avdei Paro, and compare them, if you will, with avodim hayinu leparo b'mitzrayim. There's a fundamental difference. When the pasuk describes someone and puts that description first, it defines his very sense of identity. We are the Avdei Paro. Avdei Paro is our name. That's who we are. That's how we identify. But the Jewish people, Avodim Hayinu Lefaro b'Mitzrayim, it's a totally different syntax. We were slaves to Paro, but we weren't Avdei Paro. Chas v'sholom. We never identified ourselves with Paro. I want to talk to you about one of the most amazing miracles that takes place during this entire period, from Shmos through Va'era, and reaches, I think, its paradox, its pinnacle here in Parshas Bo. The pasuk says, "Vayigaresh Osam." This is pasuk Yud Aleph, just a few psukim ahead of ourselves. Vayigaresh Osam me'es Pinei Paro. This is the beginning of the last of the Makos, last of the set of three. And Paro throws Moshe Rabbeinu out, chases them out from Paro. I think we miss the point if we think that the act of chasing Moshe Rabbeinu out by Paro is an act of humiliation. It's an act in which Moshe Rabbeinu says, Paro says to Moshe, "Who are you? You're nobody. You have no rights to enter into my chambers, into my palace. Get out of it." No, no, no. That's not what it's all about. I believe that this pasuk indicates the amazing charisma and the tremendous awe and respect that the Mitzrim and Paro at the helm had for Moshe. By Yigarish Osam, Me'es Pnei Paro. Paro realizes that he is about to buckle under. That Moshe Rabbeinu is having such an impact in him, such an influence on him, that if he remains in the presence, he meaning Paro, in the presence of Moshe for another minute, he's going to give in, he's going to lose his stand and send the slaves out to freedom. Moshe Rabbeinu has reached this level in which they treated Moshe Rabbeinu not out of contempt, but on the contrary, out of a fear of Moshe Rabbeinu's charisma. And where can I find this almost explicitly in our parsha? Let's fast forward for a moment to the beginning of Perek Yud Aleph. And there we find in Pasuk Gimel, Ha'ish Moshe Gadol Mi'od Eretz Mitzrayim Beinei Avdei Paro Beinei Ha'am. And this man, please emphasize the word Ish, is esteemed in the eyes of Paro's servants and in the eyes of his people. What does that mean? This, to me, is the most amazing miracle of all the miracles that took place in Yetzias Mitzrayim. Paro, after all, did not have to let anyone into the palace. And anyone that spoke, shall we say, chutzpahdik to Paro, Paro could have him executed immediately, like we saw at the Sarah Ophim, if you recall. It's absolutely remarkable to understand how Moshe Rabbeinu had audience with Paro, the greatest leader of the greatest empire of its time, myriads of times, without any hesitation. And not only that, Paro, and especially the avodah of Paro, had such respect and awe. He, Moshe Rabbeinu, was gadol mi'od. The word ish is a person who's esteemed because of his chashivos. And whenever the Torah wants to emphasize the greatness and the uniqueness of Moshe, it always calls him an ish. For example, the Torah tells us in Sefer Bamidbar, Va'ish Moshe Anav Mi'od. When Miriam spoke Lashon Hara against Moshe, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Almighty himself testified that Ish Moshe Anav Mi'od. He will not take offense to what you're saying, Miriam, because he's such a humble person. He's an Ish. Or, for example, right here in Sefer Shmos, in Perek Lamed Beis, it's going to say Moshe Ha'ish. When the people complained, it's Moshe Ha'ish has delayed in coming down from Har Sinai. Ha'ish means a person who has, as we said before, a charismatic personality, a personality that's captivating. He demands respect and esteem. And this is perhaps one of the greatest miracles that reflects on Boel Paro, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is with Moshe Rabbeinu in this great, glorious partnership. I'd like to talk to you for a minute or two about the Korban Pesach, which plays such a central role in Parshas Bo. We're going to fast forward a little bit to Perek Yud Beis, Sukim, Gimel, and Dal. The Torah says, Dabru el kol adas Yisrael lemar, etc. besor lachodesh hazev yikru ish sela beis avos sela bais. Please underline, emphasize the word bias. And then in the very next pasuk, Im yimat habayis miyotz miseh, v'lakachu shcheno hakarov el beiso b'mitzas nefashos, ish lefi achlo tachosu al haseh. There are two concepts here in these two psukim respectively, but they're very closely related one to the other. The first concept is that of a bias. This concept of a bias with regard to the Korban Pesach is expressed by Chazal in the word chabura. Chabura means that a group of people will buy a single Korban Pesach together and they will form a unit. They will partake together in the Korban Pesach. If I belong to one unit, I am enjoined from eating your Pesach in a different unit. Every unit becomes a community unto itself. Isn't this the most glorious element in Yetzias Mitzrayim, in freedom from Egypt? HaKadosh Baruch Hu says that this Karban is called Pesach, which is the name of the holiday. It reflects on the essence of the holiday. What does it mean when the Jewish people leave the state of slavery? A slave is interested in his own well-being and only his own well-being. He doesn't have the ability to reach out to create a community. The first expression of Yetzias Mitzrayim, of the freedom, is community, of the bias. The bias is indicative of the greatest, highest community that you could have. Freedom is bias, but it goes beyond. The Chabura concept means mutual responsibility. When we form a community, we care for each other. The Torah's vision of a community is a community of chesed, and the emergence of that community of chesed coincides with the Korban Pesach as the great symbol of freedom. We as free people can align ourselves and create a community. In Mitzrayim, as slaves, we were enjoined. It was impossible for us to create a community. And this is the character of a free man. He is free to enter into a community, into a unit, and the emergence, the birth of this chesed community coincides with the Korban Pesach. Let me talk to you for a moment about the mentality of a slave. Avodim hayinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim. True, we were avodim, and in a legal, juridic sense, we were committed to work as slaves. For Paro, he owned us, so to speak. On a legal level, he could sell us as slaves. But I believe that avodim hayinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim is much more profound than just a legal arrangement. The Gemara tells us in the Masechta Kiddushin that an Eved, a slave, has no Kiddushin. He cannot marry a Jewish girl. Why is that so? A slave is interested in two things primarily: avoiding the blows of his taskmaster and therefore being absolutely obedient. And secondly, what can he get to eat? What meat will they supply him? The concept of a mitzvah, as we know it, is totally foreign to a slave. Because when we do mitzvahs, we don't get an immediate gratification. No one is paying us off and giving us an extra steak. So a slave who's only interested in getting the taskmaster off his back, he's not ready for mitzvahs. He's not interested in mitzvahs. Not only that, he cannot enter into a marriage relationship. Because Chazal understand that Avda behefkera nichale, Gemara in Ksubas on Daf Yud Aleph, which literally means that an Eved wants a life of freedom. That's all he wants. And marriage, let's take, for example, if we fast forward a little bit to Parshas Yisro, the Parsha of Kabbalah Satorah, in which we have what's called Hagbala, Hagbilu es atzmachem, for 3 days. It means a marriage relationship in the Torah Hashkafa requires discipline. It's not all give me another piece of meat from a flesh pot. It's not all about your self-centered pleasure. All part of that vision, that centrality of the concept of discipline, of Hagbala, Lahagbil, boundaries and limits. The Eved wants Hefkera, the Gemara says. He doesn't want boundaries and limits. He has enough of that from his taskmaster. He wants freedom. And secondly, the Gemara establishes that an Eved is potter from mitzvahs asay shazman grum. What that means is, and it's not equivalent to an Isha, as Tosfos points out, an Isha is exempt from time-bound mitzvahs, but she's certainly included in the mitzvah. And if she volunteers for the mitzvah, she will get schar for the mitzvah. And if she takes it upon herself, according to Rabbeinu Tam and the Ashkenazim, she'll make a bracha sharkitzonim mitzvot mitzvot. Not so in the case of an Eved. An Eved, by contrast, is mufka. He's excluded. He doesn't have the kedusha of Zman Grama. Those mitzvahs are totally foreign to him. And the reason for that, I believe, is because the Eved has no sense of what we spoke at the beginning of time consciousness. To an Eved, there's no difference between Boker, Erev, Tzarayim, day after day after day. It's just one continuous drudgery of work, of enslaving, of oppression and humiliation and subjugation. Just let the days pass by. There's no significance to the moment, to the infinitesimal second that we spoke about. He has no time experience. And those mitzvahs, which are all about time, what we call Zman Grum, are completely foreign to him. He lacks the very sanctity of a Ben Chorin. And furthermore, the Gemara tells us that an Eved is possibly edus. We cannot rely on his testimony in a court of law. An Eved cannot see reality as is. If you read the history that's written up by psychologists and sociologists of the Jews in the concentration camps, those who survived, you will find, and they testify to the effect that they weren't capable of thinking on their own. They weren't able to see and perceive reality in an objective term. All they saw was what the Nazis wanted them to see. All they thought and all they did. They lost their own sense of self. Rahman al-Islam. Therefore, Edu's testimony is absolutely foreign to an Eved. An Eved who has no sense of freedom, he has no control over himself, he cannot perceive reality the way he wants to perceive it, but rather he sees it through the eyes of a taskmaster, through someone else's eyes. He cannot be objective. We cannot rely on his testimony. We weren't just juridic slaves. We were existential slaves. And we reached the lowest levels. But yet, Chazal say we identified ourselves with a people. We had Sfarim, according to the Medrash, some Megillos and Sfarim that they took during the period of Yaakov Avinu when they went down to Mitzrayim. And they had a sense of identification with the Jewish nation. Oshinu es Shmam, es Malbusham, es Lashonom, etc. What was left for the Jew was simply to anticipate a glorious future, a redemption that had been promised by the divine being. That's what they had. That's what they held on to. But that's what would keep them going as a separate nation. But once they reached Har Sinai, that freedom gained an impetus that really experienced a fruition, a pinnacle of an Am Kadosh, Mamleches Kohanim, of a nation that could make its own decisions, that could see reality for what it is, that could face all the challenges and in a very disciplined way, be conscious of every single moment as a potential and as a challenge. That's the greatness of freedom. When the Jewish people leave Mitzrayim, they eat the Korban Pesach, they form a community of chesed, of caring for each other. We'll see already at Yam Suf. If you're Hashem, I don't want to anticipate what we're going to talk about in Parshas B'Shalach, as I'll say that they were in lines, in rows, and the different shvatim were looking through the water that was transparent to see how's everybody faring. 3 million people strong. And it means a community of chesed, of free people that could decide and mold their time as they wish to do so and dedicate themselves to others. That's a community that's ready for marriage. It's a community that experiences time in 3 dimensions, as we said: retrospection, appreciation, and anticipation. And from the perspective of appreciation, they evaluate every moment with a commitment to even fractions of a moment. The Korban Pesach has to be eaten according to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, not one fraction of a second after Chatzos. And the matzah has to be eaten ba'erev, and Kriyat Shema has to be recited at 9 and not at 9:01 or 9:02. This is a free nation embracing all the opportunities and all the challenges that HaKadosh Baruch Hu put in front of them. And finally, I want to end that discussion for tonight in Perek Yud Aleph, Pasuk Beis. Daber no bi'oznei ha'am v'yishalu ish me'esrei ehu v'isha me'esrei usa klei kesef u'klei zah. For anybody who's learned a little bit about Mitzvah, we know that the word shoel means someone who borrows. And when the pasuk says v'yishalu ish me'esrei ehu, I can anticipate without even looking the English translation. Yes, let them borrow each man from his friend. All the Mefarshim asked the following question: did the Jewish people have any intention, when you borrow something, you got to return it? And I want to share with you an insight of Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, a brilliant etymological and textual insight. He points out that in Parshas Mishpatim, it says, V'chi yish'al ish me'im re'ehu, which means a person borrows from his neighbor. And he says that once you add the preposition from to the word in the word me'im, from me'im re'ehu, then it means to borrow. Here in our pasuk, it doesn't say me'im re'ehu, but rather me'es re'ehu. Me'es, not me'im. Me'es, points out Rav Hirsch, indicates not borrowing, but asking. When you ask for something, you don't necessarily borrow it and commit yourself to return it. Why does the Torah put so much emphasis on this entire episode of borrowing the klei kesef, the klei dov, or shall we say, requesting a gift? And I would like to suggest a few answers. Number one, it says, Vayiten Hashem eschein ha'am b'eina Mitzrayim. Again, that same great miracle that we spoke about with regard to Moshe Rabbeinu. The Jewish personalities were charismatic, and the Mitzrayim themselves began to have a relationship of esteem towards Klal Yisrael. There was a grace that radiated from the face of the Jew, and they appreciated that. And therefore they came forward with the gifts. But I think there's another idea here that's very, very essential. Chazal tell us, and this is pure halachic legal thinking, Mashakana Eved Kana Rabba. If an Eved goes out to freedom, then 2 things are going to happen. First of all, assuming the master is forced to free his slave, he's going to deride him, he's going to humiliate him. It won't be Chein Ha'am B'Einei HaMitzvah. But second of all, he's going to tell the slave, go out with the shirt on your back. He's not going to allow him to take possessions, because everything that the Eved possessed during his avdus, during this entire duration, belongs to his master. But freedom and geula means that now the Jewish people come into their own. They now possess all their possessions. I think perhaps there's a third idea, maybe the most profound idea, as to why this episode appears no less than 3 times in Sefer Shmos. And it's already part of the original promise at the bris bein of Sorim to Avram Avinu, v'achrei chen yetzu b'rechush gadol. Here we have to fast forward to Parshas Truma. And the Torah says, Moshe says to the Jewish people, Mikol ish asher yidvenu libo tichlis trumasi. We are about to embark on the most glorious episode and enterprise in Jewish history, the building of the Mishkan. Who will come forward? Ish asher yidvenu libo. Have you ever seen what goes on when the collectors come around to ask for tzedakah, and half the people put their heads down in the siddur? Who will come forward? And the answer is each asher yidvenu libo. His heart prompts him. It's something inside him, not the compulsion from the outside. That's avdus. An eved is compelled to do what his taskmaster demands. Otherwise, he'll suffer the blows on his back. But rather, a person has to be motivated. Asher yidvenu libo. And Beli Neder will talk about this more in great depth when we get to Parshas Truma. So that this episode of the Jewish people going out of Mitzrayim with Rechush Gadol is important for 2 reasons. It indicates the great experience of freedom. We are no longer avodim, but it's also a great challenge. What will you do with this money? Will you have the Nedivus Halev to share it, to give of it, to contribute? And here the Jews passed this test with flying colors. I don't know of another enterprise of raising money, a campaign, a fundraising campaign, where the leaders of the campaign said, stop, we got too much money. Did you ever hear such a thing? If you did, let me know. I don't know, in Australia, in Florida, I don't know, in London or Manchester, I don't know where, in Mexico maybe in Mexico. Where do we find enough? And that's what Moshe Rabbeinu declared. They brought so much. They were willing to part with their most expensive jewelry that they had taken out of Mitzrayim. That's what this parsha is all about. May we zochem Yirtzeh Hashem to get together on a regular basis as we have, to study Torah, to see the insights and the beauty of Torah, to understand what it means to be a Jew, to be part of a glorious community that is committed to past, present, and future, to chesed, to ish celebase avos bias, to create one great bias, one great unity of Klal Yisrael. And if we do so, Mirza Hashem, just like we were zochet to the freedom and the geula of then, we should be zochet to the freedom and the geula in our time. Ein Yiratzon. Amen. Wish everyone a great Shabbos Parshas Bo.
Amen.
And thank you again for joining me for this shir.
Yes.
Yashikor. It was terrific. Great insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your words, your kind words. They mean a lot to me, a lot more than you think.
Oh, I'm happy to hear.
And I'll see you shortly.